Now, to make this tree thing and this UI updating process at least a little bit less abstract, I created a very basic demo app, which you find attached. To be precise, you find my lib folder attached, and you can drag and drop that into a new Flutter project created with Flutter Create. And if you do that and you then start this app, which I provided to you, you should see an app on the screen that looks something like this. Now, this is of course a very simple, not too helpful app, but it is an app where we do have some interactivity, and it is an app that can help us understand the difference between our widget tree and the build method being called and the element tree. And for that, in this UI updates demo Dart file, I created a stateful widget, UI updates demo. And this is a very simple stateful widget with a column widget being rendered here, which displays these texts and these buttons that change the state, and then this conditionally shown text here at the very bottom. So that's what's being rendered here. This is the widget tree of this UI updates demo widget, and overall, this is the widget tree that's being rendered for my app. Now, if you open the debug console here in Visual Studio Code and you restart the app, which also clears the console, you will see two log statements in there. UI updates demo create element called and UI updates demo build called. Now, these log statements are coming from my UI updates demo widget, and in there, in the build method, in its state class here, you find this print statement at the beginning of the build method, which is of course responsible for this output here. The create element output is coming from the widget class itself, because there I actually added a create element method, which we haven't added before anywhere in the course, and which you typically also don't need to add. And here I'm also not doing anything but calling the parent widget's create element method and logging something. So unless you really know what you're doing, you won't need to override this create element method and implement your own logic, though you can do this, because this is indeed a method that is also invoked by Flutter. And Flutter calls this method to create the element for this widget. And that of course would be the element connected to your widget object. And it would be this element that would be used in conjunction with all the other widget elements that make up your apps to determine when the render tree must be updated and which partial UI updates might be required. Now, what you can of course see here is that actually create element is called before build is called, but you can think of that as the element object being created and then being updated behind the scenes once your build method finished. Because it is your build method that then also tells Flutter which other widgets and widget elements must be created. Because that's also important. Flutter does not just create elements for your own widgets, but for all the widgets that make up the UI. So the padding widget gets its own element, the center widget gets its element, the column widget, and so on. And all these elements form the element tree, which is then used to find out whether UI updates are needed. And when the app is being rendered for the first time, of course, the entire element tree is new, and therefore the entire UI is rendered for the first time. So this render tree for the UI is created for the first time. But thereafter, the element tree is only updated if it needs to be updated, and the same is true for the render tree. If I, for example, click this No button now, nothing on the UI changed. If you take a look at the log though, you see that UI updates demo build was called again. And build was called again because the build method of a stateful widget, which this build method is in the end here, is always called when the state of that widget is updated. Which happens if I click the no or yes buttons, because for both buttons I call set state. Now, in case of the no button, I set my isUnderstood state to false though, and that also is my initial state, so therefore of course I did update the state, and build indeed was called again, but Flutter then determined that no new elements needed to be created because no new widgets were added. I have one widget, this text widget here at the bottom, which is displayed conditionally, but if isUnderstood is false, it's not shown, and therefore its element doesn't need to be created. So therefore this is a great example for the build method being called and the widget tree being re-evaluated and partially recreated, but the element and render trees would be left untouched if I click no initially. Now if I click yes though, that changes, because now this text here appeared, and this text is coming from this line of code where this text widget is rendered conditionally. And therefore if we take a look at the log statements, if I restart this and click yes again, we see that indeed build was called again. Create element was not called again because this UI updates demo widget does not need to be recreated. It was part of the element tree before as well. But indeed create element for this text widget would have been called internally. We're just not logging this here. But for this text widget, which now should be shown, a new element was created because initially this text widget did not have a text element because it was not included because of this condition. But once isUnderstood was set to true, which is what happens when this yes button is clicked, then this text widget becomes part of the active widget tree, if you want to call it like this, and therefore an element was created. And therefore, of course, Flutter also determined behind the scenes that the new element tree differs from the previous element tree because it now has this text element which was not part of the element tree before. Therefore, Flutter went to the actual UI, to the render tree, and updated it and rendered this text. Now this does not mean that all the rest was re-rendered as well. Flutter does not do that, but it did re-render the parts that needed updating. So this awesome text in this case here.